Dad, you're done. You're going to Sunset Manor tomorrow morning, and that's final. Those words came out of my son Michael's mouth like bullets. Cold, calculated, final. I'm Frank Morrison, 73 years old, and I've been hearing disrespect my whole life, but never from my own blood. Never from the boy I raised. I was sitting in my recliner when Michael and his sister Lisa walked into my living room like they owned the place. Hell, maybe they thought they did. They had that look, you know the one. The look people get when they think they're dealing with a problem that needs to be solved. A mess that needs cleaning up. We've made all the arrangements, Lisa chimed in, not even looking at me. Too busy checking something on her phone. Always that damn phone. The room is paid for the first month. After that, your Social Security should cover it. Social Security. That's what they thought I had to live on. That's all they figured their old man was worth. I looked at these two people standing in my living room, and something cold settled in my chest. Michael in his fancy suit, probably cost more than most folks make in a week. Lisa with her designer purse and those manicured nails that never touched a day of real work in her life. When was the last time either of them had called? When was the last time they'd visited without wanting something? I tried to remember, but the memories felt foggy, distant. What if I don't want to go? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Michael laughed. Actually laughed. Like I'd told some kind of joke. Dad, look around. This place is falling apart. You can barely take care of yourself. Last week you forgot to turn off the stove. One damn time I left the burner on for an extra hour after making soup, and suddenly I'm some senile old fool who can't function. Never mind that I built half the houses in this neighborhood with these hands. Never mind that I raised 2 kids in this very house after their mother passed. The decision's been made, Lisa said, finally looking up from her phone. Her eyes were cold, distant, like she was looking at a stranger. We're not asking, Dad. We're telling you. I studied their faces, really looked at them. These weren't my children anymore. These were strangers who happened to share my DNA. Strangers who saw me as nothing but a burden, a problem to be warehoused somewhere out of sight, out of mind. I built this house, I said quietly. Every board, every nail. And now it's time to let it go, Michael interrupted, checking his watch like he had somewhere more important to be. Time to let someone else take care of you. Take care of me. Like I was some broken-down car they were dropping off at the junkyard. Like I was damaged goods that couldn't be fixed, only discarded. Lisa was already moving toward the hallway. I'll pack some clothes for you tonight. Just the essentials. The rest, she shrugged. We'll figure out what to do with the rest later. The rest. 60 years of life, memories, belongings. The rest. What about my tools? I asked. Down in the basement, I had a workshop full of equipment. Saws, drills, hammers worn smooth from decades of use. Tools that had built careers, fed families, created homes. Dad, you won't need tools anymore, Michael said, like he was talking to a child. You'll have activities. Bingo, TV time, meals brought to your room. Bingo. Jesus Christ. I didn't argue anymore that evening. Didn't fight or yell or cause a scene. What would be the point? They'd already made up their minds. Already decided that Frank Morrison was finished, used up, ready for the scrap heap. I just sat there in my chair and watched these 2 people who used to be my children make plans for my life, like I wasn't even in the room. They talked about visiting schedules and laundry services and medication management. They talked about me like I was already gone. After they left, the house felt different. Quieter, emptier. I walked through the rooms I'd lived in for 4 decades, touching familiar objects, remembering better times. The kitchen table where we'd eaten Sunday dinners. The living room where we'd watched movies on Friday nights. The back porch where I'd taught Michael how to throw a baseball. All of it about to become someone else's memories. I stood at the window looking out at the street I'd called home for most of my adult life. Mrs. Patterson across the way was watering her garden. The Johnson kids were riding bikes in their driveway. Normal life continuing like nothing had changed. Like tomorrow morning, Frank Morrison wouldn't be disappearing from this neighborhood forever. But as I stood there in the darkness, something started stirring deep inside me. Something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't resignation. It was anger. Pure, cold anger at being dismissed, at being written off, at being treated like I didn't matter, like my opinions didn't count, like my life was over just because I'd reached some arbitrary number on a calendar. That night, I sat in my chair long after midnight, staring at the walls of the house I'd built with my own hands. The house where I'd raised 2 ungrateful children, who now saw me as nothing more than a problem to be solved. And for the first time in years, I started thinking about things I'd buried deep, things I'd kept hidden, things my children had no idea about, things that were about to change everything. The van pulled up at exactly 9 o'clock, just like Lisa said it would. I watched from my window as the driver got out, checked his clipboard, and walked up to my front door like he was delivering a package. Not a person, a package. Michael was already there, pacing in my living room with that same impatient energy he'd had as a kid when he wanted something. Lisa showed up 5 minutes later with a small suitcase that looked like it could barely hold a weekend's worth of clothes. "This is it?" I asked, looking at the tiny bag. "It's all you need," she said, not meeting my eyes. "They provide most things there. Most things. Like I was checking into a hotel instead of being shipped off to die." The driver was professional enough, polite, called me sir, and helped me to the van without making a big show of it. But I could see it in his eyes too. That look, the same one I'd seen from Michael and Lisa. The look that said, another old timer being put away. I took one last look at my house as we pulled away. 40 years of memories disappearing in the rearview mirror. The rose bushes my wife Helen had planted were blooming. She would have loved seeing them this time of year. She would have hated seeing me driven away like unwanted furniture. Sunset Manor looked exactly like what it was. A warehouse for old people. 3 stories of beige brick with tiny windows and a parking lot full of cars that belonged to visitors who probably felt guilty about being there. The sign out front was cheerful enough, with fancy lettering and a picture of a sunset that was supposed to make you think of peaceful endings. Endings. That's what this place was about. The intake process was humiliating. Forms to sign, medical histories to review, belongings to be cataloged like evidence at a crime scene. The woman behind the desk was kind enough, but she had that practiced smile that people use when they deal with situations like mine all day long. "Room 237, she said, handing me a key card. "Mr. Patterson will show you the way." Mr. Patterson was about my age, maybe a little older, with the shuffling walk of a man whose best days were long behind him. He'd been here 3 years, he told me as we walked down the hallway. Used to be an accountant. Had 2 daughters who visited once a month. Once a month. Christ. Room 237 was exactly what I expected. Small, clean, sterile. A single bed, a dresser, a chair by the window that looked out at the parking lot. The walls were that institutional green color that's supposed to be calming but just makes everything feel like a hospital. "Dinner's at 5, Mr. Patterson said. "Breakfast at 7. Lunch at noon. Activities are posted on the board downstairs. Bingo on Tuesdays and Fridays. Movie night on Saturdays." Bingo. Just like Michael said. After he left, I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around my new world. Everything I was supposed to need for the rest of my life fit in a space the size of a walk-in closet. This was it. This was how Frank Morrison's story was supposed to end. But as I sat there, something else started stirring besides anger. Memory. Sharp, clear memory of things I'd buried for years. I thought about 1987, the year Helen died, the year everything changed. Michael was 22 then, just out of college and full of big ideas about his career. Lisa was 19 and more interested in boys than anything else. Neither one of them had any idea what their father was going through, trying to keep the family together while grieving the only woman he'd ever loved. That was the year I made decisions. Hard decisions. Smart decisions that my children knew nothing about. You see, Helen's death taught me something important. It taught me that life can change in an instant, that the people you count on might not always be there, that you better have a plan, because nobody else is going to take care of you when things go bad. So I made a plan. I thought about the construction business I'd built from nothing. Started with just me and a pickup truck, doing small jobs around the neighborhood. By the time Helen passed, Morrison Construction had 12 full-time employees and contracts all over Detroit. Good, steady money that most people assumed I was spending as fast as I made it. Most people were wrong. I thought about the land deals. The property I'd bought cheap in areas that everybody said would never amount to anything. Land that sat empty for years while I paid taxes on it and people called me crazy. Land that developers eventually came looking for when the city started expanding. I thought about the investments, not stocks or bonds or any of that Wall Street nonsense. Real things. Tangible things. Things that would hold their value no matter what happened to the economy or the government or anything else. Michael and Lisa thought their old man was just a simple construction worker who lived paycheck to paycheck. They thought the house and the truck and the basic lifestyle was all there was. They never asked questions about where the money went. Never wondered how a blue-collar guy managed to put 2 kids through college without taking out loans. They never wondered because they never cared enough to wonder. Sitting in that sterile room at Sunset Manor, I realized something that almost made me smile. My own children had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They'd shown their hand, revealed exactly what they thought of me, and they had no idea what they'd just walked away from. That first night in the nursing home was long. The walls were thin, and I could hear Mr. Patterson snoring next door. Down the hall, someone was coughing. The night nurse made her rounds every 2 hours, her shoes squeaking on the linoleum floor. I lay in that narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, and started making plans of my own. Real plans. The kind of plans that would teach my ungrateful children exactly who they'd decided to throw away. Because Frank Morrison wasn't done. Not by a long shot. And if Michael and Lisa thought they could write me off and forget about me, they were about to learn just how wrong they could be. They wanted me out of their lives? Fine. But they were going to discover that getting rid of Frank Morrison wasn't nearly as easy as they thought. Especially when they found out what their broke old father had really been doing with his money all these years. The first week at Sunset Manor was exactly as soul-crushing as I'd expected. Wake up at 6:30 to the sound of someone's breakfast cart rattling down the hallway. Shuffle to the dining room for watery coffee and eggs that tasted like rubber. Sit through morning activities that treated grown adults like kindergarteners. Today we're going to work on our scrapbooks, the activities director announced on Tuesday morning. Her name was Jennifer, and she had that bright, condescending voice that people use when they think you can't understand normal conversation anymore. Scrapbooks. Jesus Christ. I watched the other residents dutifully cutting out pictures from magazines, gluing them onto construction paper like we were all 5 years old. Mr. Patterson was working on a page about favorite foods. Mrs. Chen was making something about gardens. Everyone just going through the motions, marking time until their next meal or their next nap or their next visitor who might never come. But I wasn't watching the scrapbook activity. I was watching the staff, learning their routines, figuring out how this place really worked. Jennifer left at 4 o'clock every day. The day nurse, Carol, was replaced by the evening nurse, Susan, at 3:30. There was a 15-minute gap where nobody was paying attention to much of anything except the shift change paperwork. The security guard, a kid named Tony, who couldn't have been more than 25, spent most of his time playing games on his phone. The cameras in the lobby were obvious, but the side exit near the laundry room? That one just led to an empty hallway that connected to the parking garage. By Friday, I had the whole layout memorized. Every entrance, every exit, every blind spot. Old habits from the construction business, where you always need to know how to get materials in and out of a job site without anyone noticing. That weekend I had my first visitors. Michael and Lisa showed up Saturday afternoon, right after lunch. They looked uncomfortable, like they were checking off a box on their to-do list. "How are you settling in, Dad?" Lisa asked, sitting on the edge of the visitor's chair like she might need to run at any moment. "Oh, it's great," I said, keeping my voice flat. "Yesterday we made friendship bracelets. Tomorrow I think we're going to learn how to use finger paints." Michael shifted in his seat. "Dad, you don't have to be sarcastic. This place has good ratings. The staff seems nice." Nice. Like that was supposed to make up for being treated like a toddler. "How's the house?" I asked. Lisa and Michael exchanged a look. One of those quick glances that said they'd been talking about things they didn't want me to know about. We're handling it, Michael said. Taking care of everything. Taking care of everything. That probably meant they were already planning to sell it. Probably already had a realtor walking through, pricing out my life by the square foot. Find anything interesting going through my stuff? I asked casually. Another look between them. Just the usual, Lisa said. Some old tools, paperwork, photos. Nothing important. Nothing important. They'd been through my house for a week and found nothing important. That almost made me laugh out loud. Because they'd looked in all the obvious places. The desk drawers, the bedroom closet, the kitchen cabinets. They'd probably spent hours going through boxes of old bills and tax returns, looking for bank statements and investment accounts. They had no idea that Frank Morrison had been a lot smarter than they gave him credit for. After they left, I sat in my room thinking about the conversation. They'd found nothing important. That meant they still thought their old man was just a broke retiree with nothing but Social Security to his name. Perfect. That night, I made my first real move. Around 11 o'clock, when the hallways were quiet, and Tony was deep into whatever game he was playing on his phone, I took a walk. Not to escape, not yet. Just to test the waters. I made it all the way to the side exit without anyone noticing. The door was locked, but the lock was just a standard deadbolt. Nothing I couldn't handle with the right tools. The parking garage beyond was dimly lit and mostly empty except for a few cars belonging to the night staff. More importantly, it connected to the street. No fences, no guards. Just a straight shot to freedom for anyone smart enough to time it right. I was back in my room within 20 minutes. Tony never looked up from his phone. The night nurse never left her station. As far as anyone knew, Frank Morrison had spent the entire evening sleeping peacefully in room 237. But now I knew something they didn't. I knew that when the time came, getting out of this place would be easier than they thought. The question wasn't whether I could escape. The question was what I was going to do once I got out. Sunday morning, I called my bank. The first bank, anyway. The one Michael and Lisa probably knew about. The one where I kept just enough money to look like a regular retiree living on a fixed income. Mr. Morrison, the customer service representative said, "How can I help you today?" "I need to know who's been asking questions about my account," I said. There was a pause. "Sir, I'm not sure I understand. Has anyone called asking about my finances? My children, maybe? Wanting to know about balances or transactions?" Another pause. "Well, sir, your son Michael did call last week. He said he was concerned about your ability to manage your accounts and wanted to know about setting up power of attorney." Power of attorney. Those bastards weren't just putting me away. They were planning to take control of everything. "And what did you tell him?" I asked. "Well, sir, without the proper paperwork, we couldn't discuss any account details. But he did ask about the balance, and we confirmed that you have approximately $12,000 in checking and savings." $12,000. That's what they thought was left of Frank Morrison's life savings. If only they knew. After I hung up, I sat back in my chair and actually smiled for the first time since I'd arrived at this place. My children thought they were so smart. Thought they had everything figured out. Thought they'd solved the problem of their inconvenient father. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated the old man, and they had no idea what they'd just set in motion. Because Frank Morrison had been planning for this day a lot longer than they realized. Monday morning, I made my second phone call. This one was different. This one was to a number I hadn't dialed in over 5 years. "Riverside Storage Solutions," the voice answered. "This is Frank Morrison, Unit 47B. I need to arrange access." There was a pause while they looked up my account. "Mr. Morrison, yes, sir? Your account's current. When would you like to visit?" "Soon," I said. Real soon. I'd opened that storage unit in 1988, the year after Helen died. Paid for 20 years in advance, then kept renewing it every few years like clockwork. Michael and Lisa had no idea it existed. Why would they? It wasn't in their neighborhood. Wasn't anywhere they'd ever think to look. But that wasn't the only call I needed to make. Tuesday afternoon, during arts and crafts time, I excused myself to use the bathroom. Instead, I went to the payphone in the lobby. Yeah, they still had one. Amazing what these places kept around for the comfort of their residents. I dialed a number I'd memorized 30 years ago. Rodriguez Automotive, a gruff voice answered. Carlos, it's Frank Morrison. Dead silence. Then, Frank. Jesus Christ, man, where the hell have you been? Carlos Rodriguez and I had done business together back in the day. Not construction business, different kind of business. The kind where you pay cash and don't ask too many questions about paperwork. I need a favor, Carlos. After 15 years? Man, you got some balls calling me. It's important. Another pause. What kind of favor? The kind that pays well, real well. I'm listening. I need transportation. Something with papers. Something clean. How clean? Clean enough that my kids won't be able to trace it back to their old man. Carlos laughed. Your kids giving you trouble? You could say that. When do you need it? Soon. I'll call you back with details. I hung up before he could ask any more questions. Carlos didn't need to know about the nursing home or the storage unit or any of the rest of it. He just needed to know that Frank Morrison still paid his debts and kept his word. Wednesday, I had another visit from Michael. This time he came alone. How are you feeling, Dad? He asked, settling into the visitor's chair like he was planning to stay a while. Like $1,000,000, I said. Why? I wanted to talk to you about some practical matters. Financial things. Here it comes, I thought. Lisa and I have been looking at your situation, he continued. Your expenses, your income. We're concerned about how you're going to afford this place long term. My Social Security covers it. For now. But what if the rates go up? What if you need additional care? We think it would be smart to set up some safeguards. Safeguards. That's what he was calling it. What kind of safeguards? Power of attorney. Just basic stuff, so Lisa and I can help manage your accounts if you need us to. I studied my son's face. He looked so earnest, so concerned, like he was really worried about his old man's financial security. But I could see what was really going on. They'd gone through my house, found nothing valuable, checked my known bank account, and discovered that dear old Dad was running on fumes. They thought they were stuck with nursing home bills for a broke father. They thought they needed control of my finances to protect themselves, not me. I'll think about it, I said. Dad, it's really for the best. It would give you peace of mind. Peace of mind. Right. After he left, I sat in my room and thought about the conversation. They were moving faster than I'd expected. The vultures were circling, ready to pick the bones clean. But they were circling around a carcass that wasn't nearly as dead as they thought. Thursday morning, I put my plan into motion. I'd been watching the laundry routine for 2 weeks. Every Thursday at 2 p.m., a service truck came to pick up the dirty linens and deliver clean ones. The driver always came in through the side entrance, spent about 30 minutes loading and unloading, then left the same way. At 1:45, I positioned myself near the laundry room. At exactly 2 p.m., the truck arrived. The driver was a heavy-set guy named Jim, who'd been doing this route for years. I'd chatted with him a few times during my walks around the facility. Hey, Jim, I said, as he wheeled in a cart of clean sheets. Mr. Morrison, how's it going? Can't complain. Say, you ever give anyone a ride into town? He looked around nervously. I'm not supposed to transport residents, sir. I pulled out a $20 bill. Not officially, of course. But if someone needed to run a quick errand, Jim looked at the money, then at me. How quick? Couple hours, tops. You could pick me up on your way back. He pocketed the 20. Loading dock, 3 o'clock. Don't make me wait. Perfect. At 3 p.m. sharp, I was waiting by the loading dock. Jim pulled up in his personal truck, a beat-up Ford that had seen better days. Where to? He asked as I climbed in. Riverside Storage, I said. Off Highway 8. The storage facility hadn't changed much in the years since I'd been there. Same chain-link fence, same concrete buildings, same bored-looking kid working the office. Unit 47B was in the back corner, away from the main traffic. I'd chosen it specifically for privacy. Jim waited in the truck while I walked up to the unit and unlocked it. The metal door rolled up with a screech that echoed off the concrete walls. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. Boxes stacked neatly against the walls, a workbench with tools arranged precisely, and in the center, covered by a tarp, the reason I'd kept this place all these years. I pulled off the tarp and almost smiled. A 1969 Harley-Davidson Electroglide, completely restored. Chrome that still gleamed despite the years. Black leather seat without a crack. The registration was in a false name, paid for with cash back when cash could still buy you anonymity. But that wasn't all. In the boxes along the walls were 30 years' worth of careful planning. Cash, gold coins, bearer bonds, property deeds, investment certificates. All the things a smart man accumulates when he doesn't trust banks or governments or anyone else to take care of his future, including his own children. I opened one box and counted out $10,000 in cash, enough for what I needed to do next. This was just the beginning. I stuffed the cash into a small canvas bag I'd brought and took one last look around the storage unit. Everything else could wait. The bike, the documents, the rest of my real assets. They weren't going anywhere. But now I had what I needed to start the next phase of my plan. I pulled the tarp back over the Harley and locked up the unit. Jim was getting nervous by the time I got back to his truck, checking his watch and tapping the steering wheel. "We good?" he asked. "Better than good," I told him. The ride back to Sunset Manor was quiet. Jim knew better than to ask questions about what he'd seen, and I wasn't in the mood to explain. I had him drop me off at the side entrance at exactly 4:30, right during the shift change when nobody would notice one more person walking through the halls. I made it back to my room without anyone asking where I'd been. As far as the staff knew, Frank Morrison had spent the afternoon napping in his chair like a good little resident. That evening, I made another call to Carlos. This time, I was ready to talk specifics. "I need that ride we discussed," I said, "and I need it clean enough to pass inspection." Carlos quoted me a price that would have shocked most people. To me, it was pocket change. "When can you have it ready?" I asked. "Give me 72 hours, he said. "Same drop point as the old days?" I knew the place, an abandoned gas station on the outskirts of Detroit where Carlos had conducted business for decades. "Cash on delivery," I said. "Wouldn't have it any other way, Frank." Friday morning brought another surprise visitor. Lisa showed up during breakfast, looking more frazzled than I'd seen her in years. She found me in the dining room picking at scrambled eggs that tasted like cardboard. "Dad, we need to talk," she said, sitting down across from me without waiting for an invitation. "About what?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea. "About your finances. Michael told me he talked to you about the power of attorney." I nodded and kept eating my terrible eggs. "He said you wanted to think about it." "Dad, there's nothing to think about. We're trying to help you." Help me. Sure they were. "What's the hurry?" I asked. "The hurry is that this place costs $3,000 a month, and your Social Security only covers 2/3 of that." Lisa's voice was getting sharper, more desperate. "We're already paying the difference out of our own pockets." Out of their own pockets. That was rich. They dumped me here thinking I was broke, and now they were panicking because they thought they'd be stuck with the bills. "Maybe I should just find a cheaper place," I suggested. "Dad, this is one of the nicer facilities in the area. You don't want to go somewhere less comfortable." Less comfortable. She meant somewhere that warehoused poor people instead of middle-class retirees. Somewhere with shared rooms and institutional food and staff that didn't pretend to care about your dignity. "The power of attorney would just give us the ability to help manage things," Lisa continued. "Pay bills, handle paperwork, nothing major. Nothing major. Except complete control over what they thought were my assets. Except the legal right to make decisions about my money without consulting me. Except turning me into a child who couldn't be trusted with his own checkbook." "I said I'd think about it," I repeated. Lisa's face tightened. "Dad, you're not thinking clearly about this. That's why we need to make these arrangements now, while you're still competent. While I'm still competent." There it was, the real threat. Sign over control willingly, or they'd have me declared mentally unfit and take it anyway. I looked at my daughter across the table and realized that I was looking at a stranger. This wasn't the little girl I'd taught to ride a bicycle. This wasn't the teenager I'd stayed up worrying about when she was out too late. This was a woman who saw her father as nothing more than a financial liability that needed to be managed. All right, I said quietly. "I'll sign the papers." Lisa's face brightened. "Really? That's wonderful, Dad. I'll have Michael draw up the documents and we can take care of it this weekend." She leaned over and patted my hand like I was a good dog who'd finally learned to heel. "You're making the right choice." The right choice. If only she knew what choices her old man was really making. After she left, I went back to my room and sat by the window looking out at the parking lot. Cars coming and going. Visitors arriving to check on their guilty consciences. Staff members heading home to their real lives while people like me were left behind to count down our remaining days. But not Frank Morrison. Frank Morrison was done counting down. It was time to start counting up. Saturday morning I told the nurse I wasn't feeling well and wanted to stay in my room. Nothing serious, just tired. She made a note in my chart and left me alone. Perfect. At 10 a.m. I made my move. The Saturday staff was smaller, more relaxed. Tony wasn't working weekends, and the replacement security guard was an older guy named Pete, who spent most of his time reading newspapers in the lobby. I walked to the side exit like I was just taking my usual stroll around the building. The lock was still just a standard deadbolt, and I'd been working with my hands for 50 years. It took me less than 2 minutes to get it open. The parking garage was quiet. Most of the weekend visitors wouldn't arrive until afternoon. I walked to the street level and kept going, heading toward the bus stop 6 blocks away. An old man walking down the sidewalk didn't attract any attention. Might as well have been invisible. The bus took me downtown, where I caught another bus to the east side. By noon, I was standing in front of a small office building that looked like it had seen better days. The sign on the door read, "Metropolitan Investigations, Discretion Guaranteed." I'd hired private investigators before, back in the construction days when I needed to know which city officials could be trusted and which ones had their hands out. This wasn't that kind of job, but it required the same kind of discretion. The investigator was a woman named Sarah Chen, maybe 40 years old, with the sharp eyes of someone who'd seen enough of the world to know that family secrets were usually the dirtiest kind. "I need you to look into my children," I told her after explaining the basic situation. "I need to know about their finances, their jobs, their debts, everything." Sarah quoted me a rate and a timeline. I paid her retainer in cash and gave her Michael and Lisa's full names and addresses. "Anything specific you're looking for?" she asked. "Desperation," I said. "I want to know exactly how desperate they are." She nodded like that was the most normal request in the world. Maybe in her line of work, it was. I was back at Sunset Manor by 4 p.m., just in time for dinner. Nobody had noticed I was gone. Nobody had missed me. Frank Morrison was just another invisible old man shuffling through his final days. But that was about to change. By Tuesday, I'd have transportation. By next week, I'd have information about my children that they probably thought nobody else knew. And then the real fun would begin. Tuesday came faster than I expected. I spent Monday acting like the perfect nursing home resident, shuffling to meals on time, participating in the morning exercise class where we lifted soup cans and pretended it was physical therapy, even sitting through an afternoon of bingo where the biggest prize was a $5 gift card to Walmart. All the while, I was watching the clock, counting down the hours until I could put the next piece of my plan into motion. At 2 a.m. Tuesday morning, I was wide awake in my narrow bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the night shift, the squeaky shoes in the hallway, Mr. Patterson's snoring through the thin wall, the distant hum of the vending machines down by the lobby. I'd memorized every sound this place made in the dark. More importantly, I'd memorized when those sounds stopped, when the staff got lazy, when nobody was paying attention to anything except their smartphones and their coffee. I dressed quietly in the darkness. Dark jeans, dark shirt, the kind of clothes that wouldn't stand out in a crowd or catch light in a security camera. I'd been planning this outfit for days, washing the clothes piece by piece in my bathroom sink so they wouldn't smell like the industrial detergent this place used for everything. At 3:15 a.m., I made my move. The night nurse was in the break room, probably catching up on her stories or scrolling through social media. The security guard was doing his rounds on the second floor, which meant I had exactly 12 minutes before he made it back to the lobby. The side exit was easier this time. I'd practiced the lock 3 more times during my evening walks. and could have opened it blindfolded. The parking garage was empty except for a beat-up Honda that belonged to one of the night staff. I walked through it like I owned the place, out to the street, and kept walking until I reached the bus stop. Even at 3:30 in the morning, Detroit had public transportation for people who needed to get places they probably shouldn't be going. The abandoned gas station looked exactly like it had 15 years ago when I'd last done business with Carlos. Same broken windows, same weeds growing through the cracked asphalt, same sense that this was a place where normal rules didn't apply. Carlos was already there, leaning against a truck that had seen better decades. He hadn't changed much either. Still built like a bouncer, still had that careful way of watching everything at once that comes from years of conducting business in places where trust is a luxury nobody can afford. "Frank Morrison," he said, shaking his head. "I was starting to think you'd died." "Not yet," I said. "But according to my kids, I might as well have." Carlos laughed and gestured toward a motorcycle covered by a tarp. "You sure about this? It's been a long time since you rode." I pulled off the tarp and felt something stir in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. It was a Harley-Davidson Street Bob, maybe 5 years old, black as midnight with chrome that gleamed even in the dim streetlight. Clean registration and a name that wouldn't trace back to Frank Morrison or anyone else my children might think to investigate. "She's Cherry," Carlos said. "Previous owner took real good care of her. Papers are solid. As far as anyone knows, this bike has belonged to Robert Fletcher of Grand Rapids for the past 2 years. Robert Fletcher. I liked that. Frank Morrison was an old man dying in a nursing home, but Robert Fletcher could be anyone he wanted to be. I ran my hands over the bike's fuel tank, feeling the smooth paint and the promise of freedom that every motorcycle carries in its engine. It had been 25 years since I'd owned a bike, but some things you never forget. Some things stay in your bones. "How much?" I asked, though Carlos had already quoted me a price. "Same as I told you, 15 grand. I pulled out the canvas bag and counted out the money while Carlos watched. Cash was becoming harder to use these days, but it was still the currency of choice for transactions that needed to stay off the books. Carlos pocketed the bills and handed me the keys and registration. "You need anything else? Place to store it? Gear?" "Not yet," I said, "but I might be calling you again soon. Always happy to do business with a man who pays his debts." I kick-started the Harley and felt the engine rumble to life beneath me. The sound was like thunder, like freedom, like everything my children thought I was too old and weak to handle anymore. I rode it slowly out of the lot, getting reacquainted with the feel of a bike beneath me, remembering muscle memory that had been sleeping for decades. By the time I reached the main road, it felt like I'd never stopped riding. I didn't go back to Sunset Manor immediately. Instead, I rode through the empty streets of Detroit, past neighborhoods I'd helped build back when this city still believed in its future, past construction sites where I'd worked as a young man, past the house where Helen and I had lived when we were first married, past places that held memories of a life my children knew nothing about. The wind was cold on my face, but it was the first time I'd felt truly alive since they dumped me in that nursing home. I parked the bike in a 24-hour storage facility about 3 miles from Sunset Manor, paid for a month in advance with cash, and walked back through the pre-dawn darkness. The return trip took me an hour, but I made it back to my room by 5:30 a.m., a full hour before the day shift arrived. I undressed quickly and climbed back into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin like I'd been sleeping peacefully all night. At 6:30, when the breakfast cart came rattling down the hallway, I was just another elderly resident slowly waking up to another boring day in paradise. The nurse who checked on me found me groggy and disoriented, like I'd been sleeping heavily for hours. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," she said cheerfully. "How are we feeling today?" "Tired," I said, which wasn't exactly a lie. "But ready for whatever the day brings." Ready for whatever the day brings. If only she knew what I was really ready for. If only my children knew what their old man had been doing while they slept safely in their beds, probably dreaming about power of attorney documents and nursing home bills. But they'd find out soon enough. Frank Morrison was done being invisible, done being dismissed, done being treated like a problem that could be warehoused and forgotten. The real Frank Morrison was back, and Robert Fletcher was just getting started. Wednesday morning brought a phone call that changed everything. I was sitting in the dining room, choking down oatmeal that tasted like paste, when one of the nurses approached my table. "Mr. Morrison, you have a call at the front desk," she said. "It's important." I followed her to the lobby, wondering who could possibly be calling me at 9 a.m. on a Wednesday. The answer surprised me. "Mr. Morrison, this is Sarah Chen. We spoke on Saturday." The private investigator. I'd almost forgotten about her in the excitement of acquiring my new ride. "What did you find?" I asked, keeping my voice low. There were other residents wandering around the lobby, and sound carried in this place. "More than you probably expected," she said. "Can we meet?" "What I found isn't something we should discuss over the phone." "When and where?" "There's a diner called Mel's on Corktown. Can you get there this afternoon?" I thought about my options. Another escape from Sunset Manor would be risky, but the urgency in Sarah's voice told me this was worth the risk. 2 o'clock, I said. "I'll be there." Getting out for the second time in a week required more creativity. I couldn't use the same excuse about feeling sick, and I couldn't risk another nighttime escape so soon after Tuesday's adventure. Instead, I waited until afternoon visiting hours and simply walked out the front door. The trick was confidence. I put on my best clothes, combed my hair, and walked through the lobby like I was meeting family for lunch. The receptionist barely looked up from her computer. As far as she knew, Mr. Morrison's son was picking him up for a nice afternoon out. The bus ride to Corktown gave me time to think about what Sarah might have discovered. I'd hired her to dig into Michael and Lisa's finances, to find out exactly how desperate they were for money. But her tone suggested she'd found something bigger than simple financial trouble. Mel's Diner was the kind of place that had been serving coffee and burgers since the 1950s, and looked like it hadn't been redecorated since then. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floor, a jukebox in the corner that probably still played for a quarter. Sarah was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a manila folder on the table in front of her. "Mr. Morrison," she said, standing to shake my hand. "Thank you for coming." Up close, Sarah Chen looked even sharper than she had in her office. The kind of woman who noticed details that other people missed, who asked questions that made people uncomfortable. The kind of investigator you wanted on your side when you needed to know the truth about people you thought you could trust. "What did you find?" I asked, sliding into the booth across from her. Sarah opened the manila folder and spread several documents across the table. Bank statements, credit reports, loan applications, court filings. The paper trail of people whose financial lives were more complicated than they appeared. "Your son Michael," she began, "is in serious trouble. His investment firm has been under investigation by the SEC for the past 8 months. They're looking at potential fraud charges related to client funds." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What kind of fraud? The kind where client money disappears into personal accounts. Michael's been using investor funds to cover his own debts. The feds are building a case, but these things take time. He probably thinks he can replace the money before anyone notices. Sarah slid a bank statement across the table. Michael's personal account showed deposits and withdrawals that painted a clear picture of someone desperately juggling money to stay ahead of disaster. "How much are we talking about?" I asked. "Conservative estimate? $300,000. Maybe more." 300,000. No wonder he was so eager to get power of attorney over my finances. He wasn't just trying to control a broke old man's Social Security checks. He was looking for any source of money he could get his hands on before the government came knocking. "What about Lisa?" Sarah flipped to another set of documents. "Your daughter's situation is different, but equally desperate. She and her husband are 6 months behind on their mortgage. The bank has already started foreclosure proceedings." I stared at the foreclosure notice with Lisa's name on it. My little girl, who used to come to me with scraped knees and broken toys, was about to lose her house. "There's more," Sarah continued. "Her husband lost his job 4 months ago. They've been living on credit cards and loans from family members, including a $15,000 loan from Michael. So they were both drowning. And they thought their old man might be their lifeline. Except they believed the lifeline was barely strong enough to keep me afloat, let alone save both of them from going under. They put you in that nursing home thinking you were broke," Sarah said, reading my thoughts. "But they're hoping you're not as broke as you appear. They're probably planning to go through your affairs more thoroughly once they have legal control. I leaned back in the booth, processing what I'd learned. My children hadn't just abandoned me out of convenience or indifference. They'd abandoned me out of desperation, then tried to position themselves to benefit from whatever scraps they might find in the wreckage of my life. It was worse than I'd thought, and better than I'd hoped. "Is there anything else?" I asked. Sarah hesitated, then pulled out one more document. "This is the hardest part, Mr. Morrison. I found records of conversations between your children and the staff at Sunset Manor. They've been asking about your mental state, your cognitive function. They're building a case to have you declared mentally incompetent." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not just power of attorney, but complete control. They wanted to have me declared legally unable to make my own decisions, which would give them total authority over every aspect of my life and finances. "When?" I asked. "The paperwork was filed yesterday. You'll probably be served within the week." Yesterday. While I was riding through Detroit on my motorcycle, breathing free air and remembering what it felt like to be alive, my own children were in a lawyer's office trying to have me declared mentally defective. "There's a hearing scheduled for next Friday," Sarah continued. "If you don't contest it, or if you can't mount an effective defense, they'll get what they want." I paid Sarah for her work and walked out of the diner feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. But underneath the shock and hurt, something else was building. Something that felt a lot like rage. Pure, cold, focused rage at being betrayed by the people who were supposed to love me most. They thought they were so smart. Thought they could manipulate a senile old man into signing away his rights, then swoop in to clean up whatever financial mess they'd created with other people's money. The bus ride back to Sunset Manor gave me time to think. By the time I walked through the front doors, I'd made a decision. Frank Morrison wasn't going to fight this battle. Frank Morrison was going to disappear. But Robert Fletcher? Robert Fletcher was going to teach Michael and Lisa Morrison exactly what happened when you underestimated the wrong old man. The real war was about to begin. Thursday morning I got dressed like a man preparing for his own funeral. Dark suit, white shirt, black tie, the same outfit I'd worn to Helen's service 25 years ago. When the nurse asked why I was dressed so formally, I told her I was expecting visitors. Important visitors who needed to see me at my best. She smiled, that condescending smile they all used, and told me how nice I looked. If only she knew what I was really preparing for. The documents arrived at 10:30 a.m., delivered by a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Legal papers declaring that Michael and Lisa Morrison were seeking guardianship of their father due to diminished mental capacity and inability to care for himself. The hearing was scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. in Wayne County Court. Less than 24 hours to prepare a defense against my own children. I read through the petition carefully, noting every lie, every half-truth, every twisted interpretation of normal aging that they'd used to build their case. According to these documents, Frank Morrison was a confused, possibly delusional old man who couldn't be trusted to make rational decisions about his own welfare. They cited the forgotten stove burner, my resistance to moving to assisted living, and several conversations with nursing home staff where I'd supposedly shown signs of paranoid thinking and difficulty accepting reality. The paranoid thinking was particularly rich. Apparently, my belief that my children were trying to control my finances was evidence of mental instability rather than an accurate assessment of their actual intentions. But the most damning evidence was a statement from Dr. Reynolds, the nursing home's physician, describing my apparent confusion about financial matters and unrealistic beliefs about personal wealth. They'd been setting this up for weeks, carefully documenting every interaction to build a case that Frank Morrison was no longer competent to manage his own affairs. I had to admit, it was a thorough job. If I really was the broken-down old man they described, I wouldn't stand a chance in court. But Frank Morrison wasn't going to court. Frank Morrison was about to cease to exist. At 2 p.m., I called the one lawyer I still trusted from the old days. Danny Kowalski had handled legal work for my construction business, back when having a lawyer meant keeping someone on retainer who knew how to keep his mouth shut and handle problems that couldn't be solved in polite company. "Frank Morrison," Danny said when he heard my voice. "I thought you were dead." "Not yet. but my kids are working on it. I explained the situation quickly, focusing on the timeline and the legal implications. Danny listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I'd always liked about him. "You want to fight this?" he asked when I finished. "No," I said. "I want to disappear." There was a long pause. "Disappear how?" "Legally. Completely. Frank Morrison needs to stop existing before that hearing tomorrow." Another pause. "That's not simple, Frank. That's complicated and expensive and—" "How much?" I asked. $50,000, minimum. And it would take weeks, maybe months. What if I told you I could pay $100,000 and needed it done by tonight? The line went quiet. When Danny spoke again, his voice had changed. "What aren't you telling me, Frank?" "Everything," I said. "But I'm about to tell you enough to get the job done." I spent the next hour on the phone with Danny, walking him through what I needed. Not witness protection or anything dramatic like that. Just the legal paperwork to establish that Frank Morrison had died peacefully in his sleep at Sunset Manor Assisted Living on Thursday night. A death certificate that would hold up to casual inspection. Cremation papers that explained why there was no body. Estate documents that transferred his remaining assets to a trust that didn't exist. It wasn't permanent, but it would buy me time to execute the next phase of my plan. "This is insane, Frank," Danny said when I finished explaining. "If they catch you, it's fraud. Multiple felonies. You could spend your real final years in prison." "If they catch Frank Morrison," I corrected. "But Frank Morrison is going to be dead by midnight." The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Old people died in nursing homes every day. Staff turnover was high, records were often incomplete, and nobody looked too closely at paperwork when it involved elderly residents with no remaining family support. Danny had contacts at the county clerk's office who could backdate the necessary documents. For the right price, Frank Morrison could become a statistic instead of a problem. At 6 p.m., I made my final preparations. I packed the few personal items I actually cared about into a small duffel bag. Photos of Helen, my father's watch, the leather wallet I'd carried for 30 years. Everything else could stay behind as props in the room of a dead man. I wrote a brief note to be found by the morning staff explaining that I knew my children were trying to have me declared incompetent and that I couldn't bear the shame of losing my independence. A suicide note, essentially. Though the fictional Frank Morrison had simply had a heart attack brought on by stress and disappointment. At 11 p.m., I disabled the smoke detector in my room and lit a small fire in the wastebasket. Nothing dangerous. Just enough smoke to trigger the building's fire alarm and create the chaos I needed to disappear in the confusion. When the alarm started screaming and residents began evacuating into the hallways, I slipped out through the side exit I'd used twice before. This time, I wasn't coming back. By midnight, I was 3 miles away, retrieving my motorcycle from the storage unit and preparing to become someone else entirely. Behind me, the fire department was probably just finishing their inspection of Sunset Manor, determining that the small fire in room 237 had been extinguished with minimal damage. In a few hours, the day shift would discover that Frank Morrison had suffered a fatal heart attack during the excitement and confusion of the evacuation. My children would get the call Friday morning, just hours before their scheduled court hearing. They'd arrive at the nursing home to find their father dead and their legal case moot. There would be paperwork to sign, arrangements to make, a small estate to settle. They'd probably feel guilty for about a week before moving on with their lives, relieved that the problem of their inconvenient father had solved itself. But their problems were just beginning. Because while Frank Morrison was dead, Robert Fletcher was very much alive. And Robert Fletcher knew exactly who Michael and Lisa Morrison really were. Robert Fletcher's first order of business was buying proper riding gear. At 6 a.m. Friday morning, while my children were probably just getting the call about their father's sudden death, I walked into Davidson Leather and spent $2,000 on everything a serious rider needed. Black leather jacket with armor padding, matching chaps, boots that could take a beating, gloves that gripped the handlebars like they were meant to be there. The works. The kid behind the counter looked at me like I was crazy. "You sure about all this, Pops?" he asked. "Most guys your age are trading in their bikes, not gearing up for the road." "I'm not most guys," I told him. When I walked out of that shop, Frank Morrison was completely gone. In his place stood a man who looked every inch the part of an old-school biker. Gray beard, weathered face, leather head to toe, and eyes that had seen enough of the world to know that respect was something you earned, not something people handed you because you'd managed to stay alive for 73 years. I spent Friday riding through Detroit, getting familiar with my new identity, watching the city wake up around me. Nobody looked twice at another biker on the road. I was invisible again, but this time by choice. At 2 p.m. I parked across the street from Wayne County Court and watched my children arrive for a hearing that would never happen. Michael looked sharp in his expensive suit, probably the same one he wore when he was stealing money from his clients. Lisa was dressed for a funeral, which was fitting since she was about to attend one. They stood outside the courthouse for 20 minutes, checking their phones and looking confused. Eventually, a clerk came out to tell them what they already knew, but hadn't quite processed yet. You can't seek guardianship of a dead man. The hearing was canceled. The case was closed. Frank Morrison's brief return to legal relevance was over before it started. I watched them walk back to Michael's BMW, their shoulders slumped in what might have been grief, but looked more like frustration. They'd been so close to getting control of what they thought were my assets. So close to solving their financial problems with their dead father's money. That evening, I attended my own visitation. Davidson Funeral Home was handling the arrangements, and Danny had made sure everything looked legitimate. Small service, closed casket due to the sudden nature of death. Minimal flowers because Frank Morrison had outlived most of his friends. I sat in the back row wearing my leather jacket and watched my children play their parts. Michael gave a short speech about what a good father I'd been, how much I'd taught him about hard work and responsibility. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Lisa cried appropriate tears and accepted condolences from the dozen or so people who'd shown up out of obligation or curiosity. Neither of them mentioned the guardianship hearing. Neither of them talked about the nursing home or the power of attorney documents or any of their real reasons for wanting their father safely buried. They played the role of grieving children perfectly, and maybe they even believed some of it themselves. After the service, I followed them to a nearby restaurant where they met with someone I didn't recognize, a thin man in an expensive suit who carried himself like a lawyer or an accountant. Someone who dealt with the kind of problems that required discretion and cash. I couldn't hear their conversation from my table across the room, but their body language told the story clearly enough. Michael was agitated, gesturing with his hands, probably explaining how their safety net had just died of a heart attack. Lisa looked defeated, staring into her coffee like it might contain answers to questions she didn't want to ask. The thin man was taking notes, calculating options, figuring out how much trouble his clients were really in. They were in more trouble than they knew, because while they were mourning the death of their broke father, Robert Fletcher was planning his next move. And Robert Fletcher had resources that Frank Morrison had never let his children see. Saturday morning, I rode to the first bank on my list. Not the one Michael and Lisa knew about, with its $12,000 in checking and savings. This was a private bank in Birmingham, the kind that catered to clients who valued discretion above all else. "Mr. Fletcher," the bank manager said, greeting me like the valued customer I'd been for 15 years. "What can we do for you today?" "I need to make some transfers," I said. "Some investments, some purchases." "Of course. What did you have in mind?" I smiled for the first time since this whole mess started. "I want to buy some businesses. Specifically, I want to buy the businesses that are about to foreclose on my children." The bank manager didn't even blink. When you're dealing with someone who keeps 7 figures in cash reserves, you learn not to ask too many questions about motivation. "I'll need some details," he said, pulling out a legal pad. "Names, addresses, current financial situations." "Oh," I said, pulling out the folder Sarah Chen had prepared for me. "I have plenty of details." 6 months later, I was sitting in my favorite booth at Mel's Diner when Michael walked in looking like a man who'd aged 10 years in half that time. He didn't recognize me at first. The leather jacket, the beard, the confidence that came from being a man who'd taken control of his own destiny instead of waiting for death in a nursing home chair. But when I stood up and called his name, I saw the exact moment when recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Hello, son," I said, gesturing to the seat across from me. We need to talk. Michael's face went through about 6 different emotions in the space of 10 seconds. Shock, disbelief, fear, anger, and finally something that might have been relief. Dad? But we had a funeral. I saw the death certificate. You saw what I wanted you to see, I said calmly. Sit down before you fall down. He collapsed into the booth like his legs had given out. I don't understand. How is this possible? It's possible because your old man is a lot smarter than you gave him credit for, I said. And because I had help from people who know how to make things happen when the price is right. I slid a manila folder across the table. Open it. Inside were copies of everything. The SEC investigation into his investment firm. The embezzlement charges that were coming down next week. The foreclosure notice on Lisa's house. The fake death certificate. The real estate transactions that had occurred over the past 6 months. You bought the bank, Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. You bought the bank that was foreclosing on Lisa's house. Among other things, I said. I also bought the company that your biggest client invested with, the one you've been stealing from. Turns out when you own the company, you get to decide what happens to thieves who work there. Michael's hands were shaking as he flipped through the documents. How? Where did you get this kind of money? The same place I've been getting money for 30 years, I said, from being smarter than my children thought I was. I leaned forward, keeping my voice low and steady. You want to know the funny part? You and Lisa spent so much time trying to get power of attorney over $12,000 that you never bothered to ask where the real money was. Never wondered how a construction worker put 2 kids through college without taking loans. Never questioned how I managed to live comfortably on Social Security. The color was draining from his face. You could have asked. Could have shown some interest in your father's life beyond what you thought you could get from it. But you didn't. You just assumed I was a broke old man who'd become your problem. Dad, I'm sorry. We were desperate, and we thought... You thought you could throw me away and then pick through my belongings for anything valuable, I finished. You thought wrong. I stood up and put on my leather jacket. Here's what's going to happen. Lisa gets to keep her house, but she's going to work for the money. I bought the cleaning company that services my office buildings. She can start Monday morning at minimum wage. Michael started to speak, but I held up my hand. Your turn is more complicated. The SEC is going to file charges next week. You can go to prison for embezzlement, or you can cooperate with their investigation and testify against some bigger fish thereafter. Either way, your investment firm is finished. But there's a third option, I continued. I need someone to manage some of my legitimate business interests. Construction consulting, property management, that sort of thing. It pays enough to keep you out of bankruptcy, but you'll be working for your father instead of stealing from your clients. I pulled out my keys and headed for the door. You've got 24 hours to decide, both of you. You can try to rebuild your lives with some help from the old man you tried to throw away, or you can face the consequences of your choices alone. I stopped at the door and looked back at my son, sitting in that booth, looking like his world had just been turned upside down, which it had. By the way, I said, my death was greatly exaggerated, but your old lives? Those are finished. You killed them yourselves when you decided Frank Morrison wasn't worth your respect. I walked out of that diner and climbed onto my Harley, feeling the engine rumble to life beneath me. In the distance, I could hear thunder rolling across the Detroit sky, promising a storm that would clear the air and wash away whatever was left of the past. Frank Morrison was still dead, but Robert Fletcher was just getting started. And Michael and Lisa Morrison were about to learn that some old men don't go quietly into that good night. Some of us fight back, and some of us win. You know what? After everything I've been through, after watching my own children try to throw me away like garbage, I learned something important. It's never too late to remind people who they're dealing with. Never too late to show them that respect isn't something you lose just because you've gotten older. Sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who end up learning the hardest lessons. So tell me, if you were in my shoes, what would you have done? And while you're thinking about that, let me know what city you're listening from out there in this big wide world. Because stories like this, they happen everywhere. And maybe, just maybe, There's someone in your life who needs to hear it.